So we'll start off with the 0 card, who is usually the Fool. And he is off by himself. He's out of the tableau because he's 0. And, you know, at first it's real easy as a beginner to kind of say, oh, well, 0 is before 1. But that's actually not what happens with a 0. If you look at 0, 0 is like in between everything, before everything, after everything. It's everywhere, right? It's nothing and everything. And so the Fool, in a lot of ways, depicts something that's outside of this hero's journey completely. Oftentimes this card is depicted as someone in a state where they can kind of see everything very clearly, so it does tie into the world. We can kind of look at these cyclically as well, like we're going to end up kind of where we started. And the Fool then becomes sort of the choice to leap into the human experience in the first place, or to, you know, for those of familiar with what they do at this school, you know, the spirit child comes down the rainbow bridge, which correlates with the chakras, and, you know, just all the energy in our body that, you know, kind of we come into. Any kind of choice to leap into an endeavor, like, you know, the visual we have of people coming down to earth before, you know, choosing to come before they're conceived, you know, that whole idea. But of course this is going to relate when you're doing readings to making a leap of faith, trust, all of those things. The older images of the Fool, Stacy has one here, and we were kind of looking at that yesterday with the Oswald's Worth. I'll just go on and kind of collect some of these for you. Radiance Tarot. And this is the one that we're looking at first because it's very often the one that you'll see mimicked. Generally, this guy is either, you know, he looks like he's about to walk off a cliff, right? I mean, you can kind of see that, and he's not looking kind of scared or trepidatious about the thing either. He's just like, la, you know, I'm going to go skydiving, and I've done this a million times, and this is fine. And so he's got this very trusting look about him. If you look at his body language, he's like, his heart is wide open. He's very trusting, and we get that about him. He's usually looking over. We can see mountains in the background behind him. Visually, we can, you know, there are scenes in all of these cards that you can look at and find in other cards. You'll see these mountains reappear in the Hermit a lot of the time. Like the Hermit is usually on top of the mountain. Yeah, sometimes the Tower. For sure the Hermit. And yeah, there they are again in Judgment as we kind of come to the end of our journey, right? So the mountains are behind him. In a lot of decks, we'll also see a valley below him. And if you look closely at that valley, a lot of the time you'll find sort of little images from all over tarot world that you're about to jump into, right? You're about to jump into the human experience. And so you'll see that valley that he's about to jump into have a lot of imagery that occurs in other cards. So this is kind of the essence of who we are in spirit as we're about to like embark on a human journey or embark on a new endeavor. There's usually a little animal on this card too. In the older decks, there's usually like a cat or a dog. In this one, we have a white dog. And the nicest way that I've heard that interpreted symbolically is that the dog represents the ego, and he's pure and white. So like the ego gets like a really negative rap a lot of the time in our culture, but especially if you're like really into like Eastern thought and stuff. Oh, the ego is this horrible thing to be conquered. Well, you know, if the ego is a little dog, symbolically, this guy's master of his ego. So we don't have to worry about that. Like, the ego is not here to control us. We're the master of our ego. But to feed and look after this ego, the ego is kind of like a companion on our journey in the human experience. So we sort of need the ego for certain things. It's helpful to have a nicely developed ego on this journey. You know, not to be like self-deprecating or overblown, but just a healthy ego does help on the human journey. But we're in charge. He's here to help us, not the other way around. You know, so that kind of comes out with dog. I've seen this little white flower interpreted in a few ways. One is just basically pure intention, like going into this journey with this pure trusting intention. He'll often have some red on his outfit, and the little wallet or whatever at the end of his stick is often red, and he's got a red feather in his cap a lot of the time. And these two things, the feather and the cap, you will see appear on 3 cards in the Rider deck. You'll see it appear on the Fool, on Death, and on the Sun, usually. So yeah, there's a red feather in the cap there, and this feather's kind of floppy and fallen down in Death. So it's said to represent life force, and so, you know, it'll make sense later on why it's like, well, that's there in Death, but it's like this, and then in Rebirth or the Sun, it's like, it's back, you know. But so the feather's supposed to represent life force, and the little wallet on the end is supposed to represent sensuality and the body, which is like, it's a tool too. So it's like, we have these things that he's carrying, you know, sensuality, the body, the ego, that are kind of things that can get overblown on our journey at certain points and need to be dealt with. But here in its pure form, as we dive into a new endeavor, those things are coming along, but we're in control of them. We're carrying them, we're feeding them, but we're the master, right? So it's a little bit about the Fool card, basically just leaping into an endeavor and sort of trusting what you're doing in that sense. So the older deck, this is the Oswald Worth deck, you'll also see this in the Marseille, has a Fool who's already he's just simply going on a journey, and he's already like on the earth. We see some interesting things here. We see the knapsack still. We see that the little cat or dog is very often clawing and pulling his pants down. So it's like we've already started on this battle with the ego, pretty much. And a lot of the time when we're going into something new, this is how it can feel, right? If we really want to trust ourselves blindly and go, I just feel like I should move to blah, 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 or I should go do this degree, or I should go talk about this, or I should run for office, or whatever. And then almost immediately we get this inner critic thing happening. If it doesn't happen, you know, outside of ourselves, from our peers or our friends or our family saying, oh, you're doing something really dumb or stupid or whatever, and don't even bother, and they try, you know, to kind of tear us down, it'll happen from within ourselves a lot of the time as well. So it's kind of that's the older interpretation of the Fool. And he's just basically on a journey. One thing that's really interesting here that you'll see, you see this over here, I forgot to get this one. So the Mother Peace Tarot has this as well. We see this like random crocodile in these images over at the back. And I haven't read we see white flowers and all sorts of other stuff on these cards, but the random crocodile, I've just had people kind of talk to me about it before in kind of how reptilians kind of appear in our dreams. Makes a lot of sense to me, you know. So what did you say?
The lizard in a lot of different cultures is the dream keeper.
The dream keeper.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. He
knows things. So it's not just like this
right.
is what I dream of. It's that he can see everything.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So there's something that we know just subconsciously about reptilians, and you know, very often we hear psychologists talk about the base brain being the lizard brain or the reptilian brain, right? So to me, this sort of represents the unconscious and everything that will have an influence on. The next card kind of speaks to that too. We were looking at that a little bit yesterday. So in the background of that card we have a crocodile, and over here we do too. In the background of this card, this is little red cap, or Little Red Riding Hood, who's the fool in the Inner Child's tarot. We have the big bad wolf curled around the tree in the background, lurking, waiting for her. And the big bad wolf comes back as the devil in this card. And when we get to the devil, we'll hear a lot more about that. But basically what we see in a lot of cards is the journey ahead of us is sort of hidden in the path that we see behind the fool, if they're on a path, or in the valley, if it's more like a weight interpretation. And so, you know, this unconscious aspect of ourselves that does need to be integrated at some point is kind of lurking or waiting. And so that's my interpretation of the crocodile. There's probably a lot of other ones as well, though. So here we have the fool from the Golden Dawn Tarot. Innocent child picking a golden flower, or smelling a golden flower. And he's got a pretty big dog behind him. And that could maybe possibly be, you know, a tame dog, but it's also like, well, what do we know about dogs and wolves from, they weren't always tame. There are wild dogs. I mean, a lot of people think of the dog in that way as very representative of kind of big bad wolf or devil energy, right? It's like, here's this beast, and we can choose to domesticate that beast and have them help us, again, kind of like the ego, or they become like the stuff of our nightmares, the big bad wolf, right? Or, you know, they have a real tie to our unconscious. If you think about dogs howling at the moon and things like that, it's like they have a sense of that stuff that we are not so good in our conscious lives on picking up on. And you'll see dogs howling at the moon card, which we'll deal with later on as well. So, okay, there's the Golden Dawn. The Medicine Woman Tarot has this card as Seed. It's kind of a cool deck to learn with, because it gives you an alternate meaning, but it still has the traditional name up here in all of the corners of the major cards. So this card's called Seed, and of course a seed for an endeavor. Like, she's scattering the seeds down into the valley below her. So, seed's a really nice word to think of with the Fool, for sure. Here we have Il Matto, the Fool from the Renaissance deck. And yeah, he's a Renaissance fool for sure. He's kind of a jester. I haven't actually checked this card out before. You can kind of see like the scenarios, the valley of the tarot behind him. He's holding this little like rattle, which is his humor or his staff of life or whatever, and it's got a skull on the top of it, but it's also got grapes on it. So it's really interesting. We have, you know, as far as I'm concerned, this kind of brings a lot of what we see in the dog and the wallet and the life force stuff kind of together into like almost one symbol. You'll see kind of staffs like this in a lot of the cards, but not as like, this is kind of weird or out there or entertaining or whatever. Which it can be, like before you've stepped into something fully, it's like you're full of trust because you don't really know fully what you're undertaking, you know. But, so it's easy to be that way. But we'll see things like this, kind of circular heads on things and, you know, straight linear staffs underneath them in a few cards coming up, like the Emperor. And it's sort of a representation, if you look at it, of, you know, female and male, like, so it's unity. Before we kind of do that split into polarity, you know, here in 0, 0 is also wholeness, of course. So we have female and male together. It's also very reminiscent of like an Egyptian ankh, like which is kind of the same thing. And we'll see the ankh come up in cards, in other cards as well. The Shapeshifter Tarot, I like some of their images, I don't like others. I don't know quite how I feel about this. He's got a lot going on in this card, and it's just called Initiation instead of the Fool. So, just FYI. And then, thanks. Here's the Fool from the Mythic Tarot. So you see sort of a sunrise in the background here. He's literally jumping off a cliff in this card. Instead of a dog, we have, well, I think that's probably a hawk. I think we have a hawk up here. So instead of like an earthy animal that relates to the subconscious, in this card we have an air animal who maybe relates to spirit or superconscious. And I'm sure if I knew more about who he was, I could tell you. The Shadowscapes Tarot, which was like the Puri deck that everyone loved yesterday, has a woman kind of perched on a precipice and she's getting ready to fly, and yeah, so very much the same theme. She's got a little fox by her foot, which is the emblem in this deck of the wands, but she's also got a bunch of birds helping her out, and she doesn't have the pack, but she's got kind of red ribbons coming off here. She's got hearts. There's all sorts of little images on here, and we get the sense that these are all tools that she's carrying into, you know, her experience with her. The Arthurian, there's a few Arthurian decks. This one's called Keeper of Words, an Arthurian Tarot, which is kind of a mouthful, so I just say Arthurian deck, but just so you know which one. Merciful, right? And so he's on his journey to Camelot, aspiring to be a knight, you know, of the Round Table. So there's Percival in this deck. The Daughters of the Moon. These are these are just my interpretations of which archetype generally sort of kind of fits. The Daughters of the Moon is the feminist deck that really mixed things up, but I do manage to just about lay them out in a quasi-tableau, and the card that I think correlates the most to the Fool here is their card of the Dreamer. And so the Dreamer is like gazing into this pool, and she's kind of stopped on this journey, or you get the sense that she's going on a journey. She's got a horse behind her, so there's still an animal in the deck, not a dog, but a horse, who's a very helpful domesticated animal who also runs wild from time to time. So I would say the Dreamer is the closest there. The Fool from the Rock Art deck by Rachel Pollock, The Shining Woman. Kind of the same theme, you can see again, sort of taking flight into a valley below. And all of hers are really interesting to look at because she has actually taken these images and done something with them, but they're all from rock art images that actually existed from around the world. And her little companion book there tells you where the rock art was and how she came across it. Kind of interesting. The Fool from the Crowley Tarot. Way different. but lots of zeros. We have a cat still clawing at his leg. We've still got white flowers. He's got horns, which is a little interesting. He also has this little spiral snake symbol here, which we also see on the Hermit card a lot of the time. So that's, you know, kind of a life force symbol, or Kundalini rising symbol, or the medical industry uses that, right? And we see that as DNA as well. He's got all kinds of stuff in this card, like a tribute card. We could probably do a class just on that card. Okay, this card I didn't used to like at all. It's from Julie Kuchar-Watt's deck, which is the Ancestral Path deck, which is over on the end here. And it's out of print right now. I didn't used to like it because I was like, there's just like a random lady with cards on this. And it's sort of one of those images that you can go into because she's holding up this card. So it's like one of those, like, whoa, I forget what you call those, but like the images that just go on and on inside themselves forever.
Escher.
Yeah.
MC Escher.
Like that, yeah. So I didn't used to like this card at all because I was like, this just is too different from the traditional, you know, card. But when I really look at it now as a reader, so this is a tarot reader, right? This is actually perfect. Why I say that is because in order to do a good reading, you can't be in the situation. You have to be kind of attached from it, above it, and trusting that the universe is going to take care of you, or the good information is going to come to you, or whatever. If you're attached, like, oh, please, please, please let me see New York as the most wonderful place in the world to live, then your reading is going to be colored by that, obviously. So you do have to bring full energy into doing a reading. So I kind of like it because it is sort of going in on itself. It's like, well, we're explaining the tarot in order to explain how to use tarot. And, you sort of see that visually here. And there's a mirror behind her, and, it's interesting, but so that's my take on this, because it is really bizarre and different, but that's how I've made my peace with that card.